Well, welcome everybody. Welcome to this Innovation Forum webinar. We'll be starting shortly. As ever, there's a slight delay as everybody joins the call, but thank you very much for joining us today. I'm actually not sitting in front of a palm oil plantation. I'm in southern England, in West Bucks, and we have a panelist joining us from all around the world. As I said, thank you very much for joining us. We're going to start it very shortly, just waiting for everybody to join the call. We've got a large number of registrants for this webinar, so I just want to make sure that everybody is here who wants to join before we get into the meat of the discussion. All right, well, I think we will get cracking. There's people still joining, and I think there will be people joining inevitably over the next first few minutes of the hour, but we will get going. So welcome to this Innovation Forum webinar. I'm Ian Welsh, and I'm going to be your host for the next hour or so. Today, we're going to be talking about deforestation and in particular, asking if there is too much focus on palm oil. Of course, announcements at COP26 in Glasgow have refocused attention on the need for companies to transparently and right now immediately eliminate deforestation from their supply chains. However, new Aidenvironment research is warning palm oil buyers of the risks from non-palm deforestation by companies in the palm oil sector. And this begs the question, of course, how credible are corporate deforestation-free palm oil claims? I'm delighted to be joined by four expert panelists to lead our discussion today. I'm joined by Mark Wong, who's Head of Downstream Sustainability at Sime Darby Plantation, Chris Wakes, who's Programme Director at Aidenvironment, Ruth Nussbaum, who's Co-Founder and Director of ProForest, and Matthew Leggett, Associate Director, Sustainable Commodities and Private Sector Engagement at the Wildlife Conservation Society. Welcome to you all. And many thanks indeed to Aidenvironment for their support in bringing our panel together today, and to Innovation Forum's Anita Thompson for helping bring everyone together as well. Now, we'll bring our panel in very shortly, but we do want to hear from all of you. So please do submit points and questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom window, and I'll put them to our panel a little bit later on. Do try and keep your questions short and to the point. If you do, it is more likely that I will use them. And as usual for Innovation Forum webinars and sessions, we don't have any slides or presentations today. Our session will be discussion based. Okay, turning to our panel. Chris from Aidenvironment, perhaps you can go first. Give us a one-sentence introduction to the organisation, and then it'd be great if you could give us some highlights from your research into palm oil businesses with non-palm deforestation risks and the impacts that you're seeing from this for brands and their no deforestation peat or exploitation targets. Chris.
Thanks, Ian. Hello, everyone. Yeah, so Aidenvironment is a not-for-profit based in the Netherlands and Indonesia that works to increase the sustainability performance of companies operating in agricultural and forestry sectors. So Aidenvironment's been, one of our jobs is monitoring land use change in Indonesia, Malaysia, and Papua New Guinea. And we've observed many trends over the years. One of the key ones is that the deforestation for oil palm plantation development has decreased. Another is that we're increasingly seeing the companies clearing forest for oil palm are not really linked to international supply chains with no deforestation policies, so NDPE policies. You're seeing them increasingly with no known supply chain links, sometimes with no mill, and often linked to buyers in Indonesia's domestic biofuel sector. Another trend that we've seen is that we pick up deforestation and it's on other concessions than palm, so typically timber concessions. And it's quite a lot of deforestation. In 2020, we were able to attribute 13,000 hectares of deforestation to 5 companies alone in Indonesia for industrial trees. That's pulp and paper, plywood, rubber. And what you see a lot is that there is a big overlap between the companies operating timber concessions and palm oil concessions. We estimate it's about 64% of timber concessions are owned by companies that also operate oil palm concessions. And it's often, deforestation is on concessions owned by companies that are supplying palm oil to supply chains covered by no deforestation policies. So to look into this a little bit more and see sort of how much overlap there was and how much deforestation some of these palm oil buyers were exposed to, last year we published a report that detailed our analysis of 10 companies, 7 in Indonesia and 3 in Sarawak in Malaysia. that operate oil palm and timber concessions and sell to oil palm companies, palm oil buyers with no deforestation policies. And we found 133,000 hectares of deforestation between 2016 and 2021 for timber. When we raise this with palm oil buyers, which we've been doing for a number of years because it comes up quite often, they will almost always say that they apply their NDP policies only to oil palm. It's a commodity-specific application of the policies. There will sometimes be some discussion with a supplier about non-palm related deforestation. There is precedent, but officially it's usually the NDP policy is for palm oil. So this has raised a number of issues. One is that there's a lot of deforestation for timber, and timber has not got the, in recent years, has not had the same level of attention as palm oil. The discourse around deforestation in Indonesia and Malaysia has largely been linked to oil palm plantation development. You also have this issue of, if you're a palm oil buyer and you're claiming that you're implementing a no deforestation policy, how authentic are those claims if one of your suppliers is clearing forests? It's just not for palm oil. And then there's been this big focus, big change really in the palm oil sector in the last few years, that there's a lot of discussion about compensation, recovery of degraded habitats, degraded landscapes. And if we're looking at things more on a landscape level and sort of working towards sustainable development of landscapes focused on multiple commodities, how does that really work in a sector where no deforestation policies are applied at one commodity? So we've been advocating for the palm oil sector to expand the scope of their policies to include all deforestation that their suppliers might be implicated in, not just deforestation for oil palm. And yeah, that's what we're hoping to discuss today.
Fine. Can you give us a sense of the sort of reaction you've had from the sector then, when you presented them with this, the proposition that you should be thinking about everything that's involved in these businesses rather than just specifically palm oil?
So we've tended not to say everything, actually, because it is a complicated issue and it does present some challenges. One of the reasons we focus on industrial tree concessions is because of this overlap between palm oil and that sector. They're often operated by the same people, same companies. They're right next to each other. Most reputable palm oil companies, buyers, are monitoring their supply base. And if you're monitoring your palm oil supply base, you are, by extension, monitoring the industrial tree sector in Indonesia and Malaysia, because they're right next to each other. You can't really miss what's happening on this sector. So we used this industry as an example because it doesn't present huge logistical challenges. But I think some companies are still worried about where it would lead. You know, they will, to give them credit, they will sometimes take action. There's a case of United Malacca, is a Malaysian company that wants to develop a timber concession in Sulawesi, and they have put those plans on hold because of pressure from their palm oil buyers. So there is some movement, but as an official policy, I think there's a lot of reluctance, because where does it end? These companies often are involved in casinos, hotels, road developments. If you take it to its natural extension, I think everyone's a little bit scared of where that could lead.
Sure. Okay, well, thanks very much, Chris. Audience, do be thinking of your questions, as I said, so use the Q&A function for that, and I'll put the questions to our panelists towards the end of our session primarily. But yes, do be thinking of them now. It's always a feature of events like this that the really good questions come in with about 3 minutes to go when we have no time to answer them. So please be thinking of your 3 minute to go questions now, and we'll make sure we do get to them. Well, thanks very much, Chris. Ruth, let me turn to you. As for Chris, do give us a one sentence introduction to ProForest, and then I'm really interested to hear how much you agree with our central question. Has there been too much focus on palm oil, given the undoubted progress that the sector has made? Ruth.
Sure, and hi everyone, really nice to be here. So ProForest, for those of you that don't know us, we're a global non-profit organisation with teams in Europe, Southeast Asia, Africa, Latin America. And we really support the practical implementation of commitments to responsible sourcing and production of commodities. So we work very closely with companies through the supply chain and also support sort of sector and landscape collaboration. And so to your question, Ian, if the framing for this is that we need to end forest loss and loss of natural ecosystems, as you said, it's been emphasized again, both at the climate COP and also in all the biodiversity discussions that are ongoing. And in that context, the answer absolutely is yes, we need to stop focusing just on oil palm. And I think, and look at across both current and future deforestation drivers. And I think there's two really important reasons. The first is, as in fact Chris has just said, there's been real progress, and we need to recognize and reward progress so that people in the supply chain, in the sector, see that making those changes has a positive impact. And secondly, we need to address the actual problem, and that doesn't exclude palm. There is still more work to do, but we have to focus where the actual deforestation and conversion is happening.
Okay, so how then do you think we can best leverage action on other commodities from palm oil? Take what's been learned in the palm oil sector, and how can we leverage that in other commodities?
Yeah, sure. So I think, maybe to start with, and again, Chris, a little bit alluded to this. So one of the things that we've learned from our work, I guess over 20 years now with Proforest, is that to really change things on the ground, you need critical mass and engagement of companies at all stages of the supply chain. And a lot of the progress that was made with palm was underpinned by first all of the work through our SPO and the collaboration there, and more recently things like the Palm Oil Collaboration Group. So that kind of coming together and building critical mass is really important. And so when we look at leveraging linkages, I think what Aidenvironment have done and seeing those linkages is it's really important in raising awareness. And one of the things that we definitely need to do is raise awareness and use where people are already focused, like with palm, to raise awareness that there are issues elsewhere. And that's really important in getting high-level commitments which go right across commodities for organizations. And we've seen that starting to happen with traders, for example, where it started with palm, and now for many of them, it's across all of their commodities. And maybe investors really have a role to play here in pushing that kind of high-level awareness that says, yes, we have to commit to this across everything. But to really make changes on the ground, we need to involve actors directly. And what we've seen, I think the kind of positive is that we can accelerate by learning between commodities. So now my own experience at the moment, I'm working a lot with the Consumer Goods Forum in their Forest Positive Coalition. And there we're working with 4 commodities. And we're able to take learning from palm and apply that to soy, pulp, paper, packaging, beef, and vice versa. Take the learning there and apply it. And similarly, and lots of people both on the panel and many of the people I could see joining are very involved now in landscape initiatives. And exactly as Chris said, in landscapes, commodities are often right next to each other. And one of the things we're beginning to find is that you can start by working with one commodity, but gradually bring others into that discussion. So I mean, what I would say in summary is, first of all, do we need to go beyond palm? Absolutely. We need to focus on what's actually driving forest loss and conversion of natural ecosystems. And if we want to do that, we can leverage the linkages, but it's only a start. It would be nice if we didn't have to build the coalitions and build all of the engagement, but I think we really do. We need to engage the whole supply chain so we have the critical mass of people working together to take action on the ground.
Thanks, Ruth. I like your point around rewarding the better behaviours that the sector has demonstrated. Do you think that that's something that's really lacking? I mean, it's still very easy to kick the palm oil sector, and there's all the negativity around in consumers in general or in the palm oil sector, where in fact, actually, there's that's probably not entirely fair given the progress that's been made.
Yeah, I think it's something that we should take much more seriously, and I think that there's a growing understanding that people tend to respond to positive feedback, and if you don't get positive feedback for making change, then your kind of appetite for continuing to make change is much reduced, and particularly because almost everywhere stopping deforestation doesn't just need companies, it needs government. If government don't get positive feedback and it doesn't contribute to re-election and more popularity, they also, I mean, why would you be engaged in something that doesn't bring positive feedback? So I think it is really important that we need to be realistic about where challenges remain, but also really to recognize it in real time when progress is being made.
Great, thanks very much indeed. Matt, let me turn to you. Give us one sentence introduction to WCS, and then what are your thoughts, taking the conversation forward, what are your thoughts on the need to take a broader approach and to capture what's really worked in the palm oil sector to tackle deforestation more generally? Matt.
Great, thanks Ian, and thanks everyone for having me on. So very briefly, the Wildlife Conservation Society, we're a large NGO focused on conservation of biodiversity globally, over 60 offices, with a real interest and focus on tropical forests, and we have done for many years. I think it's really interesting to kind of hear the alignment between Chris and Ruth's points. I mean, I think absolutely agree with all the things that have been said so far. That the need to take a broader approach is almost becoming gospel, I think, in this conversation. And I guess to go to your point, Ian, which parts of that broader approach, can we learn from the palm oil progress that's been made so far? And I think there are a couple of real key ones. I mean, I think the work that's been done in the palm oil sector around traceability and transparency is incredibly shows what's possible, shows what can be achieved in very complex supply chains in many cases. The work to involve smallholder farmers or plasma farmers in the palm oil sector, but smallholder farmers perhaps in other commodity sectors, that's also has laid a pathway which we should learn from and can learn from for other commodity sectors. And I guess the final piece for me is around how to bring in and engage other stakeholders, including NGOs, environmental NGOs and local communities. I think there is still certainly work to be done on that third part, in particular the engagement of indigenous peoples, not just the palm oil sector, but in other commodity sectors globally. But those three areas I think offer us some opportunity to accelerate progress in other commodities. I think the other thing I would kind of point to is that there's a need, and Chris alluded to this earlier, that we know where deforestation is happening. We have the best possible data tools that have ever existed to tell us where deforestation and forest loss and conversion is happening. And often that loss is happening outside of major concessions. It's happening in areas where frankly speaking, there are a lot of smallholders, and a lot of those smallholders are producing multiple commodities that might enter global supply chains. So I think we do need to urgently start thinking about prioritization. That there's a need to triage the way in which we approach some of these problems. We need to make the best use of that traceability and transparency data and the tools and the data that exist to focus on these often forest and farm frontier areas, and that's something which WCS is very engaged on, because frankly we can't achieve conservation outcomes that we're hoping for without a heavy engagement in some of these conversations with the agricultural sector. So I think that's where I'd say, and I think certainly in other food commodity supply chains, particularly cocoa and coffee is a good example. That work has begun. I would like to see that accelerated, and I'd like to see those companies and the parts of those companies, because it's often people think Cargill is a company, therefore everyone in Cargill should be talking to each other. Well, the people who are sourcing coconut oil or coconuts in Cargill are different to the people who are sourcing coffee and cocoa. So I think it's really important that we recognise the complexity of the businesses we're talking to as well. So I think that's probably my key points.
Thank you very much indeed. I wonder if just go back to what the first thing you talked about, the traceability and transparency that you think the palm oil sector's done well. Can you just give us a bit more on that? What are the examples of the sorts of things that have worked, in your opinion, that then could be transferable to other supply chains?
Well, I mean, there's a number. I think there's a number of different companies have had different approaches. I think perhaps this began with a lot of investment being put into supply chains. Mapping individual farms and farmers, and I think through that process there have been a number of tools developed which kind of facilitate that process. So in Sumatra, for example, there's been some amazing work done on supply chain traceability and transparency in the palm oil sector. Increasingly, I think we're seeing a realization that a lot of NGOs and community groups hold really valuable data. So rather than going out and having to replicate a lot of those data sets, data sharing is becoming a lot more common. I think that's a real positive step forward. And tools like Trace, for example, which I'm sure many on the call are aware of, can increasingly be used by companies to try and understand perhaps pieces of the supply chain they're less familiar with. So there's a number of different success stories, I think. I think the main thing really is companies are recognizing that perhaps they don't have all the answers, and they may have good understandings of what's going on down to perhaps a mill level or some kind of sort of warehousing level in the supply chain. But beyond that, they need to kind of think about new approaches and ask questions. It's not really rocket science. A lot of it just requires a bit of hard work, a bit of field time, and a bit of investment. And often the answers then flow quite easily.
Great, thanks, Matt. And thank you, everybody. And thank you to those of you who started putting your questions for our panel. We have 5 already. Thanks very much indeed. Do keep them coming, though. As I said, we'll hopefully get through as many questions as we can, but do keep thinking about your questions and putting them onto the Q&A box. Okay, let me turn to Mark Wong from Sime Darby. Mark, thanks for your patience. Mark, from the perspective of a palm oil company, do you think that deforestation focus should be somewhere else? And what are the key points, moving from the conversation we've had already, what are the key points that you think other sectors can learn from palm oil? Mark.
No, thanks, Ian. Maybe just a quick introduction to Sime Darby Plantation, then for those on the call who may be not so familiar with us. So we're a vertically integrated palm oil plantation company with operations in Malaysia, Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, and the Solomon Islands. But I look after responsible sourcing for Sime Darby oils, which is the downstream refining business. And so the first question is there too much focus on palm oil? And I guess as a palm oil company, you'd probably expect me to say yes, right? So that's a bit of a loaded question. So it's nice to hear everyone else also echoing some points around why we know enough now to try and broaden out where the focus should be and how we should be looking at these things. And I think for us, because we've been working on sort of no deforestation, no peat, no exploitation supply chains for a while now, we've got enough insights now to understand that actually there are other things out there which are driving deforestation. So it's really a question, I think, firstly around what's the most effective way for us to deploy resources so that we can get to where the issues are. And as a palm oil plantation company, for us, it's also a question of leverage. And let me talk you through that a little bit. So the first thing is that if you look at the scope of responsibility that we already hold as a sustainable palm oil company, it's about engaging at a parent group company level. So actually for us, the conversation is already beyond our physical supply chain. It's not about potential issues within the mills, for example, the plantations that we're sourcing from. It could be, for example, sister or cousin mills which are associated with that operation because of the parent group that they sit under. So even being able to monitor at that range, even be able to trace through and engage at that level, if I'm honest, is quite taxing for companies. And to try and then extend that through to potentially affiliated companies in other sectors, whether they be timber, as Chris talked about, or mining, or even property development, means that there's actually a lot more resources that needs to be put in to really try and do that. And if I'm honest, I don't know if that's even possible to do well. at a policy level, you can put it in place, but whether ourselves as a palm oil company is able to do that well is a big question mark. But the most important thing I think around it is also about leverage. So even if you put a decent monitoring system in place where you're able to identify these potential issues, as a palm oil company, do you have leverage on these other operations to cease and desist? Because at the end of the day, what we're really trying to do is not just identify what the issues are, but we're really trying to nip these drivers at the bud. And in some cases, if you were trying to speak to a company because the person that you're selling palm oil to has an auntie who also owns some shares in a mining company, those links and that leverage isn't always there. And so from a kind of philosophical perspective, I do understand why you'd want to try and get that level of policy sort of across, but it does feel sometimes a little bit like it's a matter of convenience more than anything else, because palm oil companies are more engaged. So you reach into the toolbox, you pull out the same tool, expecting that you're going to get the same results if you keep using that. But I think we're in a situation now where we understand the issues better, and a far more effective way of doing things, or what's really needed, is that we need to kind of engage more actors and more stakeholders who are more plugged into those critical issues. Now, I'm not saying that the work in Palm is done, because it's not. And that's to your question around what we can do to help. I mean, on one hand, I think that there's actually a lot of learning that can be shared across, whether that's kind of methods or tactics that we've chosen, and Matt's spoken about traceability as an example. You can talk about the way we do satellite monitoring to try and detect issues, and even engagement approaches. So there's lots of sharing that can be done of things that work, but I think also, just as importantly, things that don't work. And the second thing I think is that, because with these issues, we now realize that we really need a cross-commodity, multi-sector approach to these things, because deforestation happens at a landscape level. And so for us, being in those landscapes, we can obviously be one of the key actors, also helping to drive the conversation at that point. But I think the other thing that's really important to try and think about these days is that, we always try and approach this issue in a kind of cookie cutter way, right? So we develop certain tools, whether it's traceability, satellite monitoring, and even the way we do assessments, and expect that we can actually just cookie cutter that across all the different landscapes to try and address the issues. I think what we're starting to see now is that we need to kind of shy away from that a little bit more, because each landscape is different. There's a different set of stakeholders, there's a different set of drivers. And so we really need to try and drive that conversation on the ground in these areas, so that we are able to develop the solutions that's most effective and required in that landscape.
Thank you. Thanks very much indeed. What do you think then, Mark, is necessary to develop more level playing fields then? What sort of things you need to see, and perhaps have seen in the palm oil sector, where it is a fair level playing field approach, so that it's easier for progress to be made? I mean, obviously, government and regulation has a clear role to play.
A level playing field, maybe another way to think of it is, how do we actually start to get the same level of understanding within the other sectors that we have in palm? And I think that's probably one of the reasons why people come and leverage on palm again, because there's been a lot of work done, a lot of understanding. I mean, if we were to look at the other sectors, whether it's timber or mining and property development as an example, there's still a fair bit of work done, I think, to be able to trace and understand who the key actors are and who the key stakeholders are, so that you can build that critical mass that Ruth was talking about. And so I think it's and I think people shy away from it a little bit, because it's a lot of work and it's going to take a long time. But the sooner we start, the sooner we're going to get to a point where we can actually put something effective on the ground.
Great, thanks very much indeed. Okay, and thank you for your questions. Let me turn to some of these now. We touched on this a little bit a while ago, and I'm thinking about traceability. I wonder, just our panel, interested to hear from our panel their thoughts on the relative traceability, or the relative ease of traceability and transparency in different sectors. Chris, do you want to go first? Our question specifically remarks that palm oil feels like it's reasonably traceable, but what about other commodities? For example, livestock, soy. What are the challenges elsewhere, Chris, that you're seeing?
Yeah, so the palm oil sector is in terms of Southeast Asia, I don't work on soy and cattle, which is more Latin America. But in some ways, the palm oil sector is a victim of its own success. Like, it is substantially more transparent than other forestry and agricultural sectors in Southeast Asia. And I am sympathetic to the argument that sort of asking palm oil sectors to incorporate other commodities is a failure of those other sectors to sort of get themselves to the level that the palm oil sector is at. Because if you have a company in Southeast Asia, because the palm oil sector, so 83% of the refining capacity in Indonesia and Malaysia operates under NDP policies. So if you have a company that has a concession in Southeast Asia, it's quite easy to link it to a palm oil buyer because there's so much transparency. It's much, much harder to link it to like a timber company, a timber concession to a timber buyer. It's much, much harder to link it to a destination because there isn't this business practice of public supply lists. You know, you don't have these very clear sourcing policies that are on their websites. So I completely agree with a lot of what Mark said. You know, the palm oil sector we have to acknowledge that they're doing a lot better than other sectors. And I think this is quite a complicated issue, and there's quite a number of different points. One is you have to get the other sectors up to the standard of the palm oil sector, because, you know, the timber sector will be transformed really by the timber buyers and seeing in that sector what we've seen in palm oil for the last few years.
Thank you. Ruth, I wondered if you could perhaps give some thoughts on the role of the upcoming or incoming EU deforestation regulations and you know, the impact they're going to have. And I've heard some people saying that there's actually a risk of moving out of high-risk areas with the you know, an unintended consequence perhaps of the regulation. So, and also in terms of thinking the requirement there for further traceability as well. Ruth.
Sure. Yeah, so I think we've seen, partly because we've had experience from the timber regulation in the past, as well as other things, that regulation is certainly a useful tool in terms of driving attention and driving a kind of real focus on an issue. And so from that perspective, it's great to see that people are thinking more and more, not only for deforestation, but human rights and other key issues about regulating. I think exactly as you say, the big concern that I think is shared, interestingly, across people with many different views on this is that a binary or unsophisticated regulation really does risk unintended consequences or kind of perverse incentives, and in particular to shift away from anywhere that's high risk, exactly as you said, because if you're in a high risk area, if you're buying soy, for example, or even palm from somewhere that there's no deforestation happening, you probably are not at risk of being asked to prove it's deforestation free, and then you lose leverage. You will tend to see the markets that don't care will continue to buy from high risk areas, but without seeking to drive change. And so many of us are really trying to push the EU to say, keep buying from high risk areas, but make sure you are being proactive in supporting change in the transition landscapes that you're transitioning from maybe having been deforestation frontiers or deforestation risk areas to becoming more stable production landscapes. And similarly, I think to the point about small farmers and smallholders, it's much easier if you trace back to a concession or a large producer to demonstrate that it's deforestation free. And I think there is a very real risk of pushing smaller players out of supply chains into Europe. So I think for both of those reasons, so lots of very positive things could come out of the regulation that could really recognize regions and jurisdictions and companies which have worked to remove conversion deforestation from their supply base or from their production areas, and that would be fantastic. But we need to do it in a way that doesn't drive these unintended consequences.
Thank you. Thanks, Ruth. Matt, I wonder if I could ask you, just to take this forward a little bit, what are the sort of incentives then that work to really get the changes in supply chain behaviours that we're trying to do? So what are the incentives that people need to think about?
That's an interesting question. As I was just thinking about what Ruth was saying and kind of reflecting somewhat on Mark's point, I think one of the fundamental differences between the palm oil sector and other sectors is the lack of investment that's gone down into trying to solve this problem. And partly that's a product of kind of NGO focus and time, but a lot of it, credit due to the companies. They have turned around and spent a lot of money. And by and large, the other sectors you hear about that are connected to deforestation risk really don't spend very much money at all in trying to help or understand what's going on in the smallholder or small business part of their supply chain. It just really doesn't get that much focus and attention. And yet the expectation is that they have high-level sourcing policies which commit to various different good and wonderful things, but the investment just isn't there at the lower part of the supply chain. And as I said that, I've now forgotten your question, Ian, so you're going to have to ask me it again. Tell me what it was.
Luckily, I wrote it down, so I wouldn't forget it. So yes, really think about incentives. What are any comments on the incentives that need to be put into place to really drive the change in supply chain behaviour?
Yeah, I mean, the incentive in the past has always been sort of fear of NGOs has been one of the big incentives to drive supply chain change in many cases. And as glib as that sounds, many of these things have happened because NGOs have banged the drum and consumers have started to pay attention. And that is important. I think it's important that NGOs out there that do this continue to do this work. I think that's have an important role to play. So I think that's key. For me, I think there's also we're living in a world where it's going to be harder and harder for companies to buy sustainable product. And, if they care about these things and they're making these commitments, we're rapidly approaching, and depending on your views, perhaps already gone over the point where if you tot up all the sustainability commitments of various different companies, and then you look at the availability of potential sustainable supply, the numbers don't match. And for certain commodities, that is absolutely 100% true. And therefore, there is a very strong commercial incentive for companies to start moving quickly on some of these issues if these are things they care about. So I think, I think that another flip side of that commercial conversation in terms of incentives to action is simply that there is an enormous untapped market in a lot of these smallholder producing areas where people don't have the support they need to produce high quality, good volumes of product, and that can represent a business opportunity. And I think that's important to recognize as well. Really what we're seeing in deforestation in many of these areas is a market failure, and that market failure needs to be addressed. And I think that is an important part of the conversation, which again, you could say has come from many of the learnings from the palm oil sector. There's a market incentive to act. And I think there are moral and ethical and legal other incentives which are certainly applying across many different landscapes, which also need to be considered. But I think it's important that sort of the nuts and bolts of the conversation don't get too far away from the commercial logic to working quickly to try and solve this problem. If companies want predictable, sustainable supply at a certain quality, then we need to work hard collectively as a bunch of stakeholders to try and address this issue.
Thanks, Matt. Mark, let me come back to you. I want you to put a slightly different question. Please feel free to comment on what you've heard from the other members of the panel. But another question we had was thinking specifically about the role of government and the challenges when governments don't appear to be perhaps putting in the level of commitment to deforestation that perhaps they should. Our question references Brazil, Indonesia, and others not committing to the level of not making the commitments necessary really for deforestation. So, how challenging is it for from your perspective when there isn't that government will and drive for deforestation to be addressed?
That's a good question. To a certain degree, I guess for the private sector, we've been working in many landscapes around voluntary commitments. So kind of, I guess, trying to put things in place that meet stakeholder expectations that maybe are going above what the local regulations are asking for. And in many cases, I think that's probably where the push for these voluntary commitments came from. I mean, if you think about campaigners going all the way back to the 60s and 70s, it was always against governments and countries, but no movement there. And so that's where the private sector started being sort of held up. Now, and so we've seen a couple of things. I mean, on one hand, there are specific examples where sometimes regulations goes against what you're trying to do with voluntary standards. So that's where it can get a little bit complicated and difficult. But we've also seen, I mean, you know, despite the rhetoric, I suppose, you know, sort of little pockets and movements of where regulations are actually starting to move. And actually that's probably where we're going to really see a big step change in terms of where things move, because at the end of the day, if you can get regulations aligned with expectations in a practical way, that's really going to help support some of that step change that we're looking to see. And so on that front, I think that the way that governments and regulators are included in the discussions is actually critical. I mean, you know, we went through almost a decade of saying business can't wait for governments, but actually I think we've also reached a point now where we can't continue without government actually at the table. And that really also lends itself a little bit to us thinking about how do we actually do that, right? Because, you know, there's different approaches that work, and sometimes it's a cultural thing. Some governments are more amenable to criticism. Others actually, it's much better to take a softly gentle approach with lots of kind of one-on-one, non-publicized discussions. And so I think this is, you know, where I come back again to that point I made earlier on around, you know, as we start to craft out these solutions for different landscapes, as we start to bring the different actors together that we think can make the most change, we really need to tailor how we do that, especially with governments.
Thanks very much indeed, Mark. Ruth, I wonder if I could put a more specific question to you. Questioner asks, the frameworks like HCV, the high conservation value, how do frameworks like that help at that landscape level? Ruth?
Thanks. So I mean, I think as one of the things that I think has been really exciting and very positive in the last couple of years is that people are realizing that you can't change practices without actually being there. Who changes things in the end is the people on the ground. And I think the point that Mark made is also a really important one, which is each landscape is its own place. Each one has its own actors who need to be involved in the process. And I think HCV, which is the high conservation value approach, which has been around now for, well, more than 20 years and applied in lots of places, certainly from our kind of very practical experience, it's a really useful tool for those that don't know it. It looks across both social and environmental values, and it provides a good framework to really look at which areas in a production landscape do you really need to focus on, because they have important value for biodiversity, or for people's cultural or day-to-day existence, or for ecosystem services, and then which areas can you prioritize for production. And that's basically what we are all trying to work out, is how can we have production landscapes where we are getting the right balance between protecting areas, producing in areas, restoring areas, as Matt and others have been talking about. We need to be looking at, we have a finite resource in the planet. How do we make sure we're using it well? And I think the advantage of HCV is it's inclusive, it's very widely used, it's in lots of legal systems, and so it's a useful tool to be using. I think there's in some landscapes it's been used extensively, in others it hasn't, and that's also important. We should be using the right tool. Now we have a great toolbox now, and so we should be using the right tool for each situation. But I definitely think it's one of the ones that in our experience has proved very useful.
Thank you very much. It comes back to the point around every landscape being unique, so you have to think about the right tools to use in an individual landscape. Chris, perhaps I come back to you. We've got a specific question about the challenges when you have companies that have no deforestation, peat and exploitation commitments, but then are deforest using shadow companies. This is something that's been exposed in the past. How do you make these companies accountable, Chris?
So the shadow company issue, yeah, that's one of the biggest challenges in the sector, is the way that often these companies are structured, the use of secrecy jurisdictions. Sometimes you get to a level where you just can't find out any more information. You see it a lot with like companies registered in the British Virgin Islands. There's various mechanisms within the industry going on to kind of provide a framework that we can all work under. The RSPO is adjudicating some cases where complainants have claimed an RSPO member is linked to a company. So we're hoping that in the next year or so, there'll be some rules that will come out that will make it easier. It's one of the challenges. It's also quite cultural. You know, Mark mentioned earlier the case of, you know, maybe an auntie owns some shares or something. You do see in Southeast Asia that family-owned businesses are quite common. So often we're trying to just work out family relationships and trying to put these quite complex ownership structures together, and then working with the palm oil buyers to sort of explain why this would constitute a group and what that means in terms of exposure. And that becomes, looking at multiple commodities, it becomes even more complex, because we're going back to what Mark said earlier. You know, if you're a palm oil buyer and you're buying from a company that is deforesting for timber, there's kind of two issues. One is, so yeah, you have to work out whether that is a company and whether that would fall under the company group approach. But there's an issue of what that means for your claims of no deforestation. If you're a palm oil buyer with a no deforestation policy and you're buying from a company like Jaram, for example, that supplies to many palm oil buyers, that has cleared about 10,000 hectares of forest for timber, can you really say you're deforestation free if that company is in your palm oil supply chain? And then you've got this question of, do you have any leverage? It might just be that, no, you can't really buy from them because you can't claim you're deforestation free, but there's nothing you can do about it because you have no leverage over them, or their palm oil business is comparatively small compared to their timber sector. So you kind of just have to accept that. And then there's a question of, okay, if you do have leverage, how do you sort of apply that, and what can you achieve from that? And it is complex. And just as you have to take landscapes, they're all very different, and take them sort of one at a time, you have to do that with companies, because you'll find all different kinds of companies. And sometimes you will come up against a big conglomerate that is so opaquely structured that it's almost a battle sort of trying to find your way through it. Other times it's quite simple.
Great, no, thanks very much indeed. Mark, do you want to comment briefly on the challenges around the shadow companies? And I would like to then turn to thinking about the biodiversity. Got a lot of questions about biodiversity in our string, but Mark.
Look, I think the only thing to really add to this, you know, because I think Chris has talked through it quite well, is that, you know, it's really complex, you know, and if you think about it, you've got financial institutions basically trying to do the same thing, right? If you look at it from a money laundering, tax evasion perspective, and you have regulators and all those resources pulled into it, and even then they haven't really been able to stamp it out. And so, you know, that's one of the challenges that we face, because, you know, we're a private company looking at trying to basically do the same thing that regulators are doing, but for palm companies and suppliers. And so I think, you know, we're trying our best, but we've also got to temper people's expectations around, you know, is this something that we can get perfect overnight? Probably not.
Okay, thanks very much indeed. Matt, I want to turn to you. Question around biodiversity. What do you think is going to be the best enabler to address biodiversity loss? Obviously, in a similar space, but slightly different to the deforestation debates. But what do you want to see or to address biodiversity loss, palm oil and more generally?
That's a huge question.
2 minutes to answer, please.
Look, I think we're not going to address biodiversity loss unless we solve these problems, you know, bluntly. You know, and to address biodiversity loss in tropical forests is really a question of how we address forest loss in many cases. Not always, because there's a lot of poaching and hunting and various other traditional activities that goes on within forest areas, but the vast amount of biodiversity has been lost as a result of agricultural conversion of forests. So, you know, the two questions are very linked. And I noted a question in the chat about kind of regulation. I think obviously regulation is incredibly important here. You know, and the establishment and the correct financing of protected area systems in Southeast Asia is critical to the long-term future of biodiversity, of course. But we also have to remember that biodiversity, you know, we don't pin it to the ground with heavy rocks. It tends to walk around, and you know, it often walks around into the concessions and plantations and areas of managed and controlled by communities outside of these protected areas. So, you know, we need to have the conversations around biodiversity and the conversations around agricultural production in the same space. And, you know, I think it's important, and we're seeing this more and more now, you know, with the various COPs, with the UNFCCC COP, and also with the Convention on Biological Diversity. We're seeing these conversations come together more and more, so that's promising. And there are businesses that are doing really good things, particularly actually the palm oil plantations, by and large, all have regulations and approaches to deal with monitoring and protecting biodiversity on plantations, and that is definitely a good thing. The main challenge right now in Southeast Asia is enough funding for the protected area systems. There just simply isn't enough funding. And we're talking, you know, it needs to be increased by a factor of 50 in most places. So that is something that needs to change.
Thank you very much indeed. I'd like to turn now to thinking a bit about Indigenous communities and smallholder farmers in particular. Ruth, perhaps you can have a think about what's the most effective way to engage with Indigenous communities, smallholder farmers, so that they can to support deforestation efforts at a landscape level. Another massive question, a whole entire conference worth of there. But if you could respond, and briefly, please, I do want to try to get through as many questions as we can. Ruth.
Yeah, I do really feel like that's a massive question, but maybe a couple of things. I mean, first of all, again, it's one of these things that it needs to be locally led and led by Indigenous peoples and smallholder farmers, or at least they need to be very much involved, so that we find the right ways to do that. I think working much more in landscapes and on the ground and bringing people together hopefully gives an opportunity to do that, because it's also very time consuming to be involved in processes, and for both many local communities, Indigenous communities, and for smallholder farmers, investing in that. I think that's the other thing. We need to be very thoughtful about making sure that the time and resource they invest is really going to come back and provide better livelihoods, better security, all of the things which will improve their lives. So not process for process sake, but really thinking about how to find what do people need and how can we best support doing that, while in turn engaging them with the continuing to protect forests and natural ecosystems.
Thanks. Thank you very much. Thanks very much indeed. I want to talk about finance for briefly now. I'm conscious of time. Mark, I wonder if you could comment on how you're seeing the relationship between the finance sector, financing of the palm oil sector, how the finance sector is now engaging on deforestation issues and what they're requiring of the sector, and how's that changing, Mark?
That's a good question. I mean, so we've been engaging with the financial sector for quite a number of years now. I think what's kind of interesting around the engagements with financial sectors was that you started to first hear questions coming from financial institutions, maybe say based in more sustainability conscious countries, right? So European countries, from the UK, from the US. And what we start, so a couple of changes. What we start to see now actually is that you start to see more local and also Asian-based financial institutions also now being very much part of that conversation. The second trend I think we see around engagements with financiers is that the conversation is also becoming, what's the word I'm looking for now? Much more in depth. So, you know, the financial sector is definitely catching up in terms of the understanding of what the issues are, and also where the leverage points are. But the one thing which I find kind of interesting is that, you know, if you look at it, so the question is, you know, they ask a bunch of questions, they've got some metrics in place, but what are they actually doing with the information they get? One thing we haven't seen a change in yet is that they're still looking at these issues still from a very a kind of negative screen, right? So, you know, do you meet criteria and do you pass the threshold for them to continue financing you? And the question we've been asking for a long time, and it's the same thing also from the buyer side, right? Is, you know, at what point will we actually start to see good behavior being rewarded? So, you know, instead of looking at it from a negative screen, you know, is there a positive screen that they can put into place? That's something where that's an area that's still developing, I would say.
Thank you very much indeed. Chris, I want to turn to you just for a very quick answer. There's a question regarding historic forest loss and how it should be best addressed. Chris, do you have any thoughts on what companies or how companies should be engaged and perhaps providing compensation for communities and for landscapes regarding historic forest loss?
Yeah, that's the big issue now. A big discussion in palm oil is deforestation rates have decreased. There's a massive discussion about what companies need to do to compensate for deforestation that has occurred in the last few years. You've got some established systems like the RSPO compensation procedure is probably the most developed, but there's company-led initiatives that are taking place. There's different, Listari Capital is one, Earthworm have their own fund that's being set up. It's what all the traders are talking about. I mean, Sime Darby have also been involved in some of these discussions. And there's commitment, really. Everyone agrees that they have profited from deforestation, so they have to compensate. The big question is, what does that look like and what mechanism? The RSPO mechanism is quite expensive. I think it's $2,500 per hectare. So there's questions about how you compensate. Do you have to compensate within the area that was cleared, or can you sort of put money into a pool and then it's used for conservation in other areas? There's questions about the government support for that. You know, Indonesia is increasingly becoming a bit more hostile to environmental movements with some of their legislation and government statements. And that's also, again, why this cross-commodity issue is important, because if you talk about recovery in just the palm oil sector, how do you do that in landscapes that are dominated by selective logging concessions, industrial tree concession, mines, where the government is the key stakeholder usually, where you've got communities, different ethnic groups. So again, it's this whole discussion about we can't look at these things in silo anymore. They won't work if you've just got the palm sector looking at their recovery liability and then discussing ways at a company level about how they can implement that. You've got to have all the different stakeholders involved, and it's this constant discussion, like you've got to expand your policy, your view, your network to other commodities and other stakeholders, because that's how it will work. But the specific recovery discussion, I think this year that's really going to be the key discussion, particularly for the trader refiners, because everyone accepts that they have to recover.
Great, thanks so much, Chris. Conscious that we're coming towards the end, I should have mentioned earlier, we have put in the chat function a link to Aidenvironment's research. So go to that now if you want to link to the research and grab the report that Chris mentioned. So my final question to everybody, and brief responses, please. What have you taken away from the conversations of the last hour? What have been the things that have stood out for you? Matt, you first.
I guess what stood out and is reassuring is I think there's a general agreement that we need to move beyond sort of commodity specific to a more commodity agnostic approach, and that the need to focus on the geographies where forest is being lost is the next obvious step, whether that's coming from palm oil or from cocoa or from soy or from coffee.
Mark, for you, thank you, Matt. Mark, for you, what are the things that have stood out for you from the last hour or so?
I think as Matt said, I think it's nice to hear that there's actually quite a lot of consensus around around what needs to be done next. And I guess for me, I'm just looking forward to welcoming other stakeholders and other sectors to come around the table and help try to address this issue with us.
Great, thanks very much, Ruth.
Certainly the alignment, but also the recognition that this is complex and that there isn't a single answer, a silver bullet, a single stakeholder group or commodity or sector that's going to do this by themselves, but quite hopeful in terms of being able to use all of the learning we have so far in moving forward, but needing to recognize that complexity.
Great, thanks, Luke. And Chris, final word to you. What do you picked up in the last hour?
Yeah, same. Like, I think it's good that we all agree pretty much on the need to look at things across commodities, and informally we have these discussions where we all tend to be of the same view, and just hopefully from this sort of public discussion we can then start formalizing things and have more discussions that can result in policies and actual sort of on the ground changes, because it's good that we all are heading in the right direction, the same direction.
Thank you. Thanks, Chris. And thanks, everybody. I want to draw things to a close then. What I've learned is that it's, however hard you try, it's very easy to let these things go around. And I apologize, we have gone over by a bit of minutes already. So that's it. Thanks very much indeed to our panel for all their time, and to Aidenvironment for the support of this webinar. We'll be in touch to share a recording of the last hour, so you can listen to it again at your leisure and share with your colleagues. And we'll include a link to the Aidenvironment research in there as well. Before we close, I just wanted to remind you that we've got a busy conference season coming with Innovation Forum. We've got our Future Food events and the next in our Business and Climate Action series. Go to the Innovation Forum website for full details and how to register for discounted passes. But for now, I hope you found this webinar interesting. I've been Ian Welsh, and thank you for joining us.